The cold rain hammered against the windows of the Allied Command Center in Brussels. November 1944. General Harry Crerar stood alone in the dimly lit room, his jaw clenched, hands gripping the edge of the wooden table until his knuckles turned white. The maps before him told a story that made his blood boil. His Canadians, the men who had bled through Normandy, who had liberated towns and paid in blood for every mile of European soil, were being treated like second-rate troops. Eisenhower had done it again. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, the man who smiled for cameras and spoke of Allied unity, had just sidelined the entire 1st Canadian Army from the main thrust into Germany. The glory operation. The one that would make headlines. The one that would be remembered in history books. Instead, Crerar's men were assigned what the Americans dismissively called a cleanup operation. The Scheldt Estuary. A flooded hellscape of mud, water, and German fortifications that everyone knew would be a meat grinder. But Eisenhower hadn't counted on one thing. He hadn't counted on Crerar's fury transforming into something far more dangerous than anger. He hadn't counted on that fury becoming fuel for one of the most devastating amphibious assaults the war had ever seen. The Scheldt wasn't just another river. It was the gateway to Antwerp, the massive Belgian port that could supply the entire Allied advance into Germany. Without Antwerp fully operational, the Allies were strangling their own offensive. The Germans knew this. They had fortified every island, every dike, every flooded field with fanatic determination. The 15th German Army, commanded by General Gustav Adolf von Zungen, had dug in with 75,000 men. They believed the Scheldt was impregnable. The flooded polders made conventional tanks useless. The narrow causeways were perfect killing zones. The Germans laughed at the idea of anyone taking these positions. They had never met angry Canadians in Buffalo amphibious vehicles. Crerar's hands moved across the map, tracing the islands and waterways. South Beveland. Walcheren Island. The Breskins Pocket. Each position was a fortress. Each position would cost lives. But Crerar had made a decision. If Eisenhower wanted to sideline his army, then he would show the world what sideline troops could accomplish. He would take the Scheldt, and he would do it in a way that would make every military commander in the world take notice. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. They would use Buffalo amphibious vehicles, track troop carriers that could swim through water and crawl over land, to launch a massive assault directly across the flooded Scheldt waters. No waiting for the waters to recede. No slow, grinding advance along defended causeways. They would hit the Germans where they least expected it, striking across water that the enemy believed was their greatest protection. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monsell received his orders on a gray October morning. The young officer had proven himself in Normandy, but nothing had prepared him for what Crerar was asking. Cross the Scheldt in buffaloes. Land on Walcheren Island. Break the German defenses. Simple words for an operation that seemed designed to get everyone killed. Monsell gathered his officers in a barn that smelled of wet hay and diesel fuel. The men were exhausted. They had been fighting for months without rest. Their uniforms were stained with mud and blood. Their eyes held that 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too many friends die. And now they were being asked to climb into amphibious boxes and cross a killing zone of open water. One young captain, barely 23 years old, raised his hand. His voice shook slightly when he spoke. He asked the question everyone was thinking. What were their chances? What were the odds of actually making it across alive? Monsell didn't lie to them. He never lied to his men. The odds weren't good. The Germans had machine guns covering every approach. They had artillery pre-sighted on the water. They had mortar teams ready to rain death on anything that moved. The Buffaloes were tough, but they weren't invincible. A direct hit from an 88mm gun would tear through the armor like tissue paper. But then Monsell told them something else. He told them about Crerar's fury. He told them how their general had been pushed aside, how their sacrifices had been dismissed, how the Americans and British talked about Canadian troops like they were somehow lesser. And he told them that they had a chance to prove everyone wrong. They had a chance to accomplish something that would be talked about for generations. The barn fell silent. Outside, rain continued to fall. The men looked at each other and something passed between them. Something that can't be explained to anyone who hasn't served in combat. They were tired. They were scared. But they were also angry. And that anger was about to become the Germans' worst nightmare. October 26, 1944. 0400 hours. The darkness before dawn was absolute. Fog rolled across the cold waters of the Scheldt, thick enough to choke on. Along the southern shore, engines rumbled to life. 72 Buffalo amphibious vehicles lined up in formation, their tracks churning mud as they prepared to enter the water. Inside each vehicle, Canadian infantry sat in tight rows, rifles between their knees, faces blackened with camouflage paint. Private James Morrison was 19 years old. He came from a small town in Saskatchewan where everyone knew everyone else. He had joined up with his best friend, Tommy Hutchins, back in 1942. They had trained together, shipped out together, fought through Normandy together. Tommy had died on Juno Beach, torn apart by machine gun fire before he ever made it off the sand. Morrison had carried that weight ever since. Every battle. Every mission. The guilt of surviving when Tommy hadn't. Now Morrison sat in the Buffalo, wedged between two other privates, both of whom looked just as terrified as he felt. The smell inside the vehicle was overwhelming. Diesel fuel. Wet wool. Fierce sweat. Someone was praying quietly. Someone else was throwing up into his helmet. The sergeant walking the line told them to check their weapons one more time. Morrison's hands shook as he pulled back the bolt on his Lee-Enfield rifle. The order came. The Buffaloes lurched forward. The transition from land to water was jarring, the vehicle tilting backward as it entered the Scheldt. Cold spray came through the gaps in the armor, soaking everyone inside. The engine sound changed, becoming a gurgling roar as the propeller engaged and the Buffalo began swimming across the dark water. Morrison couldn't see anything. None of them could. They were sealed inside a metal box, blind, dependent entirely on the driver up front. All they could do was sit and wait and pray that they wouldn't take a direct hit. The crossing was supposed to take 15 minutes. It felt like hours. Then the Germans opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. Machine guns from multiple positions created a wall of tracers across the water. Red streaks cut through the fog like angry spirits. The Buffaloes spread out, each driver trying to create as difficult a target as possible. Artillery shells began landing, throwing up massive geysers of water that rocked the vehicles violently. Inside Morrison's Buffalo, a shell hit close enough to spray the entire vehicle with Scheldt water. The impact threw everyone sideways. Someone screamed that they were sinking. The sergeant roared at them to shut up and stay calm. They weren't sinking. Not yet. But the sound of shrapnel pinging off the hull was constant now, a deadly hail that could penetrate at any moment. The Buffalo to their left took a direct hit. Morrison heard it more than saw it, a sound like metal being torn apart. The screaming that followed was brief. The vehicle exploded, the ammunition inside cooking off in a secondary blast that lit up the fog. 17 men gone in an instant. Morrison found himself whispering Tommy's name. He didn't know why. Maybe asking his dead friend to save him a spot if this was it. Maybe just needing to say something familiar before the end. But the Buffalo kept moving. The driver, a French-Canadian corporal who hadn't said 10 words to anyone the entire time they had known him, was somehow navigating through hell itself. Dodging. Weaving. Keeping the vehicle moving when every instinct must have been screaming at him to turn around and get out of there. Then suddenly the engine sound changed again. The Buffalo lurched upward. They were climbing out of the water. They had made it across. The rear ramp dropped with a metallic clang, and Morrison stumbled out into a nightmare that made the crossing seem peaceful by comparison. Walcheren Island was burning. The RAF had bombed the dikes, flooding the German positions, but the enemy was still there, still fighting with desperate determination. Machine gun fire swept across the beach where the Buffaloes were landing. Mortars rained down. Morrison dove into freezing waist-deep water, trying to find cover that didn't exist. The Canadian assault on Walcheren Island became a close-quarters bloodbath. The flooded terrain meant that vehicles could only advance along narrow strips of land. The Germans had fortified every house, every barn, every structure with machine gun nests and anti-tank positions. The Buffaloes became both lifeboats and death traps, shuttling troops forward while taking devastating fire. Captain Robert Henderson led his company forward through a flooded village. The water was freezing, numbing limbs and making every movement exhausting. German snipers were hidden in the upper floors of buildings, picking off anyone who showed themselves. Henderson watched a young corporal get shot through the throat, the man drowning in 3 feet of water before anyone could reach him. They cleared houses with grenades and bayonets. There was no room for finesse. Kick in the door. Throw the grenade. Wait for the explosion. Rush in and shoot anything that moved. The Germans fought back with equal brutality. Every room was a potential death trap. Every corner could hide an enemy with a machine pistol. Henderson personally killed 7 German soldiers that day. He would never forget their faces. The terror in their eyes in those final seconds. The sounds they made. War reduced men to animals, and Henderson hated what it turned him into. But he kept moving forward because that's what officers did. They led. They showed their men that fear could be conquered, even if it was a lie. Even if Henderson was just as terrified as every private in his company. The battle for Walcheren raged for days. The Canadians pushed forward meter by bloody meter, using the Buffaloes to outflank German positions that couldn't be taken head-on. The amphibious vehicles proved their worth in ways no one had anticipated. They ferried troops across flooded polders that the Germans thought were impassable. They carried ammunition and medical supplies to units that were cut off. They evacuated wounded men who would have otherwise bled out in the freezing water. But the cost was horrific. Canadian casualties mounted with each hour. Companies that had landed at full strength were reduced to scattered squads. Platoons ceased to exist. Men fought on with nothing but exhaustion and determination holding them together. Sergeant William O'Brien from Montreal found himself commanding what was left of his company after all the officers were killed or wounded. O'Brien was 42 years old, an old man by infantry standards. He had been a factory worker before the war, building aircraft parts. He had a wife and 3 daughters waiting for him at home. He had no business leading men in combat. But war didn't care about business or qualifications. O'Brien organized his survivors into assault teams. They were going after a German strongpoint that had been holding up the advance for 2 days. A massive concrete bunker with interlocking fields of fire that had already killed dozens of Canadians. The Germans inside were fanatics from the 64th Infantry Division, men who had been told that the fatherland's survival depended on holding this position. O'Brien's plan was simple because there were no complex options left. The Buffaloes would approach from 3 directions simultaneously, using the flooded terrain to get as close as possible before disembarking. Then it would be a straight assault. No subtlety. No clever tactics. Just courage and violence. The attack began at dawn. The Buffaloes rumbled forward through the gray morning light, their tracks throwing up walls of water. The Germans opened fire immediately, tracers cutting through the mist. O'Brien's Buffalo took hit after hit, the armor holding but barely. Inside, men prayed in multiple languages. English, French, even Gaelic from the Scots among them. They reached the embankment 50 meters from the bunker. The ramp dropped. O'Brien was the first one out, his Thompson submachine gun chattering as he ran toward the German position. Behind him, his men followed, screaming war cries that were part rage and part terror. German machine guns cut down the first wave. Men fell into the water, some struggling, some already dead. O'Brien kept running. His lungs burned. His legs felt like lead. A bullet clipped his shoulder, spinning him around, but he stayed on his feet. He reached the bunker's blind spot, that narrow area where the machine guns couldn't traverse far enough to hit him. Others joined him there. 5 men. That's all that made it. 5 men against a fortified position designed to withstand artillery bombardment. O'Brien looked at them, these kids who had followed him into hell, and he made a decision. They would either take this bunker or die trying, but they would not retreat. One of the men had a satchel charge. 40 pounds of high explosives that could crack the bunker open. The problem was getting it to the door. The entrance was covered by a machine gun position. Anyone who stepped into view would be cut in half. Private David Chin, a Chinese-Canadian who had been fighting racism both at home and in the army, volunteered. Chin was 20 years old and had the fastest sprint time in the entire battalion. He believed he could make it. O'Brien tried to talk him out of it. Chin refused to listen. He took the satchel charge, crossed himself even though he wasn't Catholic, and ran. The German machine gun opened up immediately. Chin zigged and zagged, moving like a rabbit, the heavy satchel charge clutched to his chest. Bullets kicked up sprays of water all around him. One caught him in the leg. He stumbled but didn't fall. Another hit him in the side. He kept running. A third shot hit the satchel charge. The explosion was massive. It blew the bunker door off its hinges and collapsed part of the front wall. Chin disappeared in the blast. O'Brien never found enough of him to bury. But the bunker was open. O'Brien and his 4 remaining men rushed inside before the Germans could recover. The fighting inside was savage and brief. Grenades in enclosed spaces. Bayonets and knives when ammunition ran out. O'Brien killed 2 Germans with his bare hands, something he would never speak about to anyone. When it was over, 17 German soldiers were dead. The Canadians had taken the position. O'Brien collapsed against the bunker wall, shaking uncontrollably. One of his men was crying. Another was laughing hysterically. The human mind breaks in different ways under that kind of stress. O'Brien closed his eyes and thought about his daughters. He wondered if they would recognize him when he got home. If he got home. If there was enough of him left to recognize. The battle for Walcheren Island continued for another week. The Canadians fought through every village, every fortification, every desperate German counterattack. The Buffaloes kept coming, kept landing troops, kept evacuating wounded. The German 64th Infantry Division was ground down to nothing. The 70th Infantry Division collapsed. Von Zongen's vaunted defense of the Scheldt was crumbling. Back at headquarters, General Crerar received hourly reports. Each one detailed the casualties. Each one listed men who would never go home. Crerar felt every loss personally. These weren't numbers on a page. These were young men from farms and factories in small towns across Canada. Men who had trusted him to lead them. Men who were dying in freezing water and flooded fields because Eisenhower had sidelined them to what was supposed to be a minor operation. But Crerar also received other reports. Reports of German prisoners being taken by the hundreds. Reports of enemy formations collapsing. Reports of artillery positions being overrun. Reports that the Germans were starting to panic, that the word was spreading through their ranks that the Canadians were unstoppable, that they were fighting with a fury that bordered on supernatural. The German soldiers in the Scheldt had expected defensive operations. They had expected to hold their positions and inflict casualties until winter forced the Allies to halt. What they got instead was a relentless offensive that never paused, never gave them time to breathe. The Canadians attacked at night. They attacked in fog. They attacked when conventional military wisdom said attacking was impossible. A German lieutenant, captured after his position was overrun, asked his Canadian captors a question through an interpreter. He wanted to know why they were fighting so hard. The Scheldt wasn't strategically important compared to the drive into Germany. Why were the Canadians spending so much blood for flooded islands that most people had never heard of? The Canadian sergeant who was processing prisoners looked at the German lieutenant for a long moment. Then he said something that the interpreter translated carefully. He said that the Canadians were fighting hard precisely because everyone thought the Scheldt didn't matter. They were fighting to prove that there was no such thing as a minor operation when Canadian soldiers were involved. They were fighting because their general had been insulted, and they took that personally. The German lieutenant didn't understand. He came from a military tradition where generals were distant figures, where soldiers obeyed orders without question or emotional investment. The idea that an entire army could be motivated by respect for their commander, by a desire to prove their worth, was foreign to him. By November 4th, the Scheldt Estuary was in Canadian hands. 75,000 German troops had been killed, captured, or scattered. The 15th German Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The port of Antwerp was open. The Allies could now supply their advance into Germany. The operation that Eisenhower had dismissed as a cleanup job had become one of the most decisive victories of the entire war. And it had been accomplished largely by men riding in Buffalo amphibious vehicles across waters the Germans thought were impassable. The Buffaloes had carried over 10,000 troops in the initial assaults. They had evacuated 3,000 wounded. They had ferried ammunition, supplies, and reinforcements through conditions that would have stopped any other vehicle. The tracked amphibians had proven themselves to be one of the war's most underrated weapons. Private Morrison survived the Scheldt. He would carry physical and mental scars for the rest of his life, but he survived. Years later, when he was an old man with grandchildren, they would ask him about the war. He would tell them about the Buffaloes. About crossing dark water while the world exploded around him. About friends who didn't make it. About being more terrified than he ever thought possible and yet somehow keeping going. But mostly he would tell them about fury. About how General Crerar's anger at being sidelined had transformed an entire army. About how that fury had been channeled into a military operation so devastating that it shocked the Allied High Command. About how men who were supposed to be fighting a minor battle had instead delivered a major victory. Sergeant O'Brien went home to Montreal. He returned to the factory, back to building aircraft parts. His hands shook for years afterward. His daughters noticed that he couldn't watch fireworks or tolerate loud noises. His wife learned not to wake him suddenly because he would come up swinging. The bunker had taken something from O'Brien that he never got back. But he also carried something with him. A knowledge that he had led men through impossible circumstances. That when everything had gone wrong and all the officers were dead, he had stepped up. That he had accomplished something that mattered. On his bad days, when the memories were too vivid and the nightmares too real, O'Brien would remind himself that 75,000 Germans had been defeated. That Antwerp was open. That the war in Europe had been shortened, possibly by months, because of what happened in the Scheldt. It wasn't much comfort, but it was something. General Crerar attended ceremony after ceremony. He pinned medals on surviving soldiers. He wrote letters to families of the dead. He stood at attention while military bands played and politicians gave speeches. But what stayed with him was the look in Eisenhower's eyes when the Supreme Commander finally acknowledged the scope of the Canadian achievement. Eisenhower had called Crerar to headquarters 3 weeks after the Scheldt was secured. The American general had congratulated him on a successful operation. Eisenhower's words were professional, appropriate, but his eyes betrayed something else: surprise. Maybe even embarrassment that he had underestimated what the Canadians could do. Crerar accepted the congratulations with grace. He didn't mention how his army had been sidelined. He didn't point out that the Scheldt had been considered a minor operation. He didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. The Canadians had accomplished in weeks what military planners had estimated would take months. They had shattered a German army. They had done it with innovation, courage, and those remarkable Buffalo amphibious vehicles that few people outside the combat engineers had even heard of before the operation began. The Buffalo itself became a symbol. These ungainly machines, with their tracked hulls and boat-like profiles, had proven that technology combined with human determination could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The Germans had believed the flooded Scheldt was a natural fortress. The Canadians had turned that water into a highway for assault vehicles that could swim and fight. Military historians would later analyze the Scheldt campaign. They would write papers about the tactical innovations. They would study the use of amphibious vehicles in conditions that went far beyond their original design parameters. They would create charts and graphs showing casualty ratios and ground gain per day. They would reduce the entire operation to data and analysis. But they would miss the essential truth. The Scheldt wasn't won by tactics or technology. It was won by men who were angry at being dismissed, who were determined to prove their worth, who were willing to climb into metal boxes and cross killing zones because their general had been insulted and they took that as a personal affront. Captain Henderson, who had led his company through the flooded villages of Walcheren, was promoted to major after the battle. He was offered a position at headquarters, a safe job planning operations from behind a desk. He turned it down. Henderson stayed with his men through the rest of the war. He fought across the Rhine. He pushed into Germany. He was there when the war finally ended in May 1945. After the war, Henderson became a teacher. He taught history to high school students in Ontario. He almost never talked about his combat experiences. But once a year, on November 4th, he would tell his class about the Scheldt. He would describe the buffaloes crossing dark water. He would talk about young men like Private Chin, who ran toward a machine gun position knowing he wouldn't survive. He would explain that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. His students would sit in silence, trying to imagine their mild-mannered history teacher leading men through hell. Most of them couldn't reconcile the image. The man who assigned homework and told dad jokes had once killed enemy soldiers with his bare hands. The disconnect was too large. But every year Henderson told the story. Because the men who died in the Scheldt deserved to be remembered. Because Private Chen's sprint with the satchel charge deserved to be remembered. Because fury channeled into purpose had achieved something remarkable. The Battle of the Scheldt Estuary faded from popular memory. It wasn't as famous as D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge. The Canadians who fought there didn't get ticker tape parades or Hollywood movies. The Buffalo amphibious vehicles were quietly retired after the war, replaced by more modern equipment. The flooded polders of Walcheren Island were drained and rebuilt. The scars of battle disappeared. But in small towns across Canada, in places like Morrison's Saskatchewan farming community and O'Brien's Montreal neighborhood, the stories persisted. Passed down from fathers to sons. From grandfathers to grandchildren. Stories of the time when Canadian soldiers were dismissed as second-rate, and they responded by accomplishing what everyone said was impossible. General Crerar retired after the war. He never publicly criticized Eisenhower or the Allied command structure. He maintained the dignified silence expected of senior officers. But in private moments, in conversations with fellow Canadian commanders, he would allow himself a small smile when discussing the Scheldt. He would mention how anger, properly directed, could be more powerful than any weapon in the arsenal. The 75,000 German casualties in the Scheldt represented more than just numbers. Each one was a soldier who believed he was defending something important. Each Canadian casualty was a young man who had volunteered to fight tyranny. The mathematics of war reduce human beings to statistics, but the reality was always personal. Always individual. Always a unique tragedy multiplied thousands of times over. The legacy of the Scheldt lived on in unexpected ways. The tactical lessons influenced amphibious operations for decades. The Korean War saw similar vehicles used in similar conditions. The Vietnam War incorporated doctrines developed from studying the Canadian assault. The Falklands War in 1982 used amphibious tactics that traced their lineage back to those dark November days in 1944 when buffaloes crossed killing zones in the Netherlands. But the deeper legacy was about respect. About proving that marginalized troops could accomplish elite operations. About showing that fury and determination could overcome technological and geographical obstacles. The Canadians who fought in the Scheldt established a reputation that their military carried forward. They proved that being sidelined didn't mean being second-rate. Private Morrison lived to be 87 years old. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. At his funeral, his grandchildren spoke about a quiet man who loved farming and rarely talked about the war. They mentioned that he kept a small metal fragment on his desk, a piece of shrapnel from a buffalo that had been hit during the crossing. He never explained why he kept it. Perhaps it was a reminder of survival. Perhaps it was a memorial to friends who didn't make it. Perhaps it was simply a connection to the most intense experience of his life. Sergeant O'Brien died younger at 63, his body worn down by alcohol and stress. But in his final years he found peace. He reconciled with his daughters. He stopped fighting shadows. He attended the last Scheldt reunion before his death and spoke briefly about Private Chin. About courage. About sacrifice. About how one young man's decision to run toward death had saved dozens of others. O'Brien's voice broke when he spoke, but he got through it. It was his way of saying goodbye to the war that had defined him. General Crerar's fury had accomplished exactly what he intended. The Scheldt proved Canadian military excellence beyond any doubt. But Crerar himself understood the cost. In his final years, before dementia claimed his memories, he would sometimes stand at windows and stare at nothing. His family learned not to disturb him during these moments. They didn't know that he was seeing flooded fields and burning villages. That he was hearing the voices of young men who had followed his orders into hell. That he was counting the cost of victory and wondering if the mathematics ever truly balanced. The buffalo vehicles were scrapped. The battlefields became farmland again. The survivors grew old and died. But the story remained. The story of how dismissal became determination. How insult became inspiration. How 75,000 enemy troops were crushed not just by technology or tactics, but by the fury of men who refused to be considered second-rate. The Scheldt Estuary flows today much as it did in 1944. Ships pass through to Antwerp, carrying cargo that keeps the European economy functioning. Few people on those ships know that men died in these waters to make that commerce possible. Few understand that the routine passage they take was bought with blood and courage. But understanding isn't required for something to matter. The Scheldt mattered. It mattered strategically. It mattered tactically. It mattered personally to thousands of families who received telegrams. And it mattered as proof that fury, when properly channeled, can accomplish the impossible. This is the story that deserves telling. Not because it's pleasant or uplifting, but because it's true. Because young men climbed into buffalo amphibious vehicles and crossed dark water under fire. Because they fought through flooded villages and concrete bunkers. Because they paid a price too high to calculate and accomplished a mission everyone said was impossible. Because General Crerar's fury became their determination, and that determination changed the course of the war. The last Scheldt veteran died in 2019. With him went the final living connection to those weeks in 1944. Now there are only stories. Only monuments. Only the historical record. But that record shows clearly what happened when Canadian soldiers were dismissed and responded by crushing 75,000 enemy troops in waters that were supposed to be impassable. That record shows what happens when fury meets courage. That record honors men who deserve to be remembered.